Welcome to the launch of It Rose Up by Jack Fennell, a collection of lost literary Irish fantasy stories published by Tramp Press and launched as a part of the Dublin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am the interrogator, Sophie White, and this is, of course, Jack Fennell. He's a writer, editor, translator, and researcher. And you have already done some collected anthologies of Irish science fiction. You focus a lot on utopian and dystopian literature, monsters, and you're an academic, so you're busy.
Yeah, flat out all the time.
Flat out. And so when did your interest in collecting stories begin?
I suppose it came from when I was a kid and I couldn't get enough of those, the very best of Irish ghost stories kind of thing. Anytime I saw a book like that, I had to grab it, and I just came obsessed with collecting those types of books. And I suppose it was a natural progression from that to, God, I'd love to actually put one of those together myself someday. So thankfully then Tramp came along and made all my wishes, my dreams come true.
And before Tramp came along, you studied, some of your work in your academic studies kind of focused on that area.
Oh, yeah.
And how did you pitch that to your, say, parents when you were growing up, being like, I'm going to make this a full-time gig, guys?
Oh, they knew. Like, I was a very weird child. they were, they were not under any illusions about what I might do when I grew up. So, I just said, yeah, I'm thinking of doing a PhD on Irish science fiction. And they just said, yep, that tracks.
I like that.
That was kind of their reaction.
And so you're a doctor of sci-fi, basically.
Yes.
It's a baller title.
That's why I don't call myself doctor when I book a plane ticket.
What do you suppose might happen if there was a call for a doctor on the plane after someone fell ill? What would a doctor of sci-fi do to the person, do you think?
Like wave a phone over them and make Star Trek noises.
Attempt a kind of amateur exorcism, maybe.
Something to that effect, yeah.
And so you said you enjoyed every Irish ghost story going when you were a kid. Yep. Was storytelling a big part of your family life?
Oh yeah. My parents used to read to me when I was a kid, and they had lived in Australia before I was on the scene, so the house was full of books about Australian Aboriginal folklore and stuff. So that was what they used to read to me when I was a kid.
Oh, fascinating.
Picture books of Aboriginal myths and that kind of thing. And then I went to school and was a bit puzzled that nobody else had heard of them.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So that was kind of like a cornerstone of my early childhood. So
in school then, were you quite into Cuchulainn and...
Oh yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
It's cool. Those feel like the kind of the surface level of Irish mythology. And when did you start really diving deeper?
Well, again, like my parents, they collect, my mother in particular used to collect, all the old Lady Gregory books of Irish myth and folklore and what have you. And so I just started taking those down off the shelf and reading through them, and then coming across all these mad other characters that had been overshadowed a little bit by Cuchulainn and the Fianna. What have you, Conall Carnock, who's just like this lunatic who shows up to a bragging match with somebody's severed head in his pocket and slams it down on the table, here.
Just extremely extra behavior.
Yeah, and they were all extremely extra, which is, ideal for a small kid.
Do you think that Cuchulainn is actually kind of the mythology light end of things? He's the kind of Brad Pitt of Irish mythology. He's kind of mainstream. He's a bit less challenging than the lad with the severed head.
Well, yeah, but he had a great last stand as well, where the entire army is afraid to go near him because they don't know whether he's alive or dead, and they have to wait for a crow to land on him.
True. It's very Jason. It's very Freddy. Yeah. It's all of those guys.
Yeah.
It's so funny as well. I don't think we airbrush that much out of kids' stories at all. When it's it's often referenced how dark fairy tales are, for example.
Oh yeah.
And how dark children are. Like, I was just walking my kid to school this morning and he walked past a dog and I was like, oh, lovely doggy. And he was like, yeah, but who's going to cut the dog's head off? And I was like, oh my God, whatever runs in my veins has gotten into him. And did your family have any? I just wanted to ask you this as I was reading It Rose Up. I was like, I wonder now, what kind of family produces a man like Jack? But in my family, there was like, everyone had a ghost story. Did you have this? I remember my granny, for example, had a particular ghost story. And I think now, having grown up, I was like, this ghost story, like, did the rounds of every Irish family. Every Irish family had a distant relative who had been supposed to travel on the Titanic.
Oh, of course.
Do you know this
Yeah,
one? So my granny
yeah.
used to say that like, a second cousin of hers had a ticket for the Titanic. She was to be collected in Cove, and that an old dead relative had appeared by her bedside the night before
And warned her not to go.
And that when she woke up, she said, I had the craziest dream. And then she looked on the ground by the bed and it was soaking wet. That's it. The ghost in the dream had been soaking wet and warning of the sinking. Did you have any of those kind of floating around your family?
Well, like the house that I used to live in supposedly was haunted by the ghost of Auntie Eileen, who would have been like my great aunt, I think. And apparently, like, the ghost of Auntie Eileen was very, very quiet most of the time, but she would show up in order to tell my father and his brother to stop drinking and go to bed. You know, like around Christmas time when the whole family were gathered together, they would stay up until all hours, and then, you know, they'd say, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and told me to go to bed. Like nobody else in the house was awake. But yeah, there's little things like that.
Auntie Eileen's flicking the lights for last orders.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's very good. Do you think that we as a kind of like nation are particularly close to our kind of strange and odd stories? Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we are.
Tell me a bit about that.
Because, you know, it's like that. There's a line, I think, in The Usual Suspects where it's like, I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him. So like it's a similar kind of thing with us, you know, like
it's
I mean
superstition.
Yeah, exactly. Like we kind of know, like we know that, you know, there's no such thing as fairies and what have you, but you know, would you spend a night in a fairy fort? No.
No
like,
way.
No.
Nobody mess with that.
No,
definitely not. They are malevolent.
Yeah. Oh God, yes.
And tell me, Kate, so the stories in It Rose Up, you know, most of them date from like the 19th century. They're a couple of 100 years old. And so it's historic fantasy. But as a reader, it felt so immediate to me. And I'd love to know what you think of how kind of historic fantasy sort of still relates to us, the contemporary reader.
Well, yeah, I mean, I noticed the same thing when I was collecting them. It was like, wow, I mean, this could have been written last Thursday, you know?
Yeah,
like they're very, very kind of contemporary in that sort of sense. But I think that they hold up and they still resonate with people today because, you know, fantasy is part of everyday life anyway. I mean, like nobody has not taken a few seconds out of their day to kind of daydream about what they would rather be doing. You know, like if they're stuck in a traffic jam or if they're queuing in the bank, you know, like, God, I'd love to just, you know, feck off to the mountains or kind of live in a tree or something like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, like that impulse is common to all humanity. So, you know, stories that speak directly to it, I think, just have a bit of longevity to them. You know, that they kind of transcend the time that they were written.
Yeah, and I suppose they kind of speak to kind of like elements of the human experience that don't change.
Yeah.
Like love or
Yeah,
fear,
totally.
very particularly.
Oh, yes.
Like it's such a kind of a
yeah.
primal emotion, you know. And the things that are like scary or uncanny in the stories in It Rose Up, like they are, you know, every bit as unnerving, really, I find, to me, a modern reader. I particularly got shivers and a lot of kind of enjoyment out of the character of the talking dog in The Three Tasks.
Yeah.
And so this is a talking, smoking, very sardonic dog that kind of seems to sort of accompany a sort of a devil of sorts. His master seems to be. And a kind of a dark man is how he's described in the kind of language of the time.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a lot of the talking cat in The Master and Margarita.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Do you remember that
by
talking cat?
Bulgakov, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And even in their kind of like, just very kind of like language, kind of almost I'm bored by this mortal who's afraid of me.
Yeah, and not necessarily causing any of the havoc themselves, but kind of standing on the sideline and quietly enjoying it while they're smoking a rollie.
Yes, totally. Just kind of vaguely trolling this main character. Yeah. And yes, I did find like the humor is surprisingly timeless. Do you find that?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, very much. Indeed, and do you kind of seek that out when you're looking for the stories?
I do, because, you know, like there was a lot of, well, I'm not going to say there was a lot of, but, you know, sometimes when you come across a story that you think might be of use and you read through it and it's just like, it's a drag to read. You just like, I can't in good conscience inflict this on someone, you know. But I mean, if I read through it and I find myself having an emotional reaction to it, like, I mean, if it creeps me out, or if you know, if I find myself laughing at it, then I go, okay, maybe like this goes into the maybe pile, and then that gets whittled down.
I even think it's quite funny how your own notes as the editor going through the book interacts with the material. So, like, for example, the very first story, when you're talking about the kind of sermonizing of the main character's father, and how you yourself took the editorial decision to cut his sermonizing down a bit. I find that very funny.
And it wasn't even like, I mean, it wasn't even a question of morals or anything. I mean, he's there lecturing his son about the merits of banking and being prudent with your money and all this. Oh, God almighty. Can we please get to the underwater island?
The cool underwater island.
The cool underwater island.
Oh my God. As I said to you before we started recording, I found that underwater island really spooky. And I was just on edge the whole time because I really felt like something was about to go down. And then, I mean, I won't give it away.
Well, they don't turn out to be cannibals anyway.
Yeah, we can confirm.
Yes.
Not in that story. But I do find reading fantasy in general, I'm always a bit on edge, I suppose, because the rules of the world and the story are unknown. And I guess we're so used to, say, in fairy tales, there being a kind of a lesson or comeuppance for the kind of protagonist. So I find when I get to the end of fantasy stories and like, it hasn't hit the fan completely for the main character, I'm like, oh, okay, it was one of those kind of fantasy stories. And do you think, like, how do you feel that like fantasy is received nowadays versus kind of how readers treated fantasy back when these stories were coming out?
Well, it comes in waves. So, you know, back in like the days of Lord Byron and all those lads, I mean, everybody and their mother was writing, you know, fantasy stories or kind of dark gothic kind of supernatural stories and what have you. And then it kind of went out of fashion because then, you know, the Victorian era kicked off and it was all businessmen in charge of everything, and fantasy all of a sudden was not allowed at all. But the thing about Ireland in particular is that like we were generally assumed to be kind of flighty and airy-fairy anyway. So, you know, we were there as kind of a counterpoint to that. You know, we were just like this repository of fantasy and whimsy that the rest of the world could draw upon. And there's even a couple of instances of, you know, those collections of classic Irish fairy tales and ghost stories. There's incidents where like people have actually written original work and just passed it off as an Irish folktale. Ooh. And then it gets anthologized again and again down through. And it's only recently that people are starting to figure out, hey, hang on, you know, this is a fugazi. But so
that's very intriguing. Yeah. So it kind of becomes absorbed into the canon.
Yeah.
Ever tempted to do it yourself? You could start the anthologizing. It'd be very easy for you.
So somebody did half accuse me of doing that before for the previous anthology, A Brilliant Void.
A Brilliant Void, so that was science fiction.
That was science fiction, and they just said, like, I mean, I didn't know we had that much science fiction. I was like, well, no, it is all genuine. Trust me.
I love it. Oh my God, rumblings.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Do
you feel like naming and shaming? That is very interesting. I was quite intrigued by the like pseudonymous. God, I find it really hard to say that. But the
same here.
anonymous writers in this anthology, it is DW, isn't it?
Or EW, yeah.
Sorry, EW,
who was very prolific. Very, very prolific. Yeah, like, I mean, there was hardly an issue of the Dublin Penny Journal that was published that didn't have something by them in it.
Really?
And, you know, it's like, I was just saying to like a class of students there last week that if you see initials on a historic piece of writing, chances are that it was a woman writing and trying to hide the fact like that it was a woman writing.
For sure, that's what I was about to ask you. Yeah, is that your theory?
I think there's a strong possibility that EW was a woman and that she was writing about things that, you know, weren't considered proper for women to write about. But I'm very glad that she did.
Absolutely.
That story of the puka is amazing.
Yes, isn't it? Oh my God. It's so wild and kind of, I mean, it's just huge, so vivid. It's kind of like rambunctious, this puka.
Yeah, and that image of the puka, like, who is basically a horse crouching down in an alleyway like a cat.
Yeah.
I mean, there is something so uncanny about that. I love it.
Completely.
I mean, imagine like walking down a dark country lane at night and you see that.
Just like
lurking,
peering up at you. Yeah. No, it's very, 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 very uncanny, as you say. And this is, I suppose, an interesting lead into one of my pet questions at the moment that I'm asking of people because it's on my mind, is what you feel is the difference between spooky, scary, and creepy.
It's like God Almighty. No, I mean that's
I'm getting granular.
That's a difficult one now.
If a doctor of science fiction can't answer me.
Again, like I suppose, like, I mean, the definitions might differ according to the individual, but you know, I would kind of think of spooky as more like an aesthetic kind of thing. You know, kind of like Tim Burton, Nightmare Before Christmas. You know, the contorted willow and dry ice machine kind of stuff. Then it's like scary is like what it says on the tin, you know, actually elicits a fear emotion.
Jump scares and
and then creepy is kind of like apprehension.
Yeah, that's good.
That, or like that's what it would suggest to me, that, you know, like if you're creeped out by something, you're kind of, I don't know.
Yes, that. Like, I think the puka is a good example of creepy in that it's kind of blending sort of two demeanors, that of a horse and that of a cat. Yeah. And like two rights making a real wrong, you know?
And this guy is looking for it. He's actively trying to pick a fight with this thing. And you want to grab him by the ears and go, what are you doing?
Don't seek this thing out. And so, I mean, I suppose carrying on from your theory that EW is a woman, what do you think about the power of the female characters in these stories?
Well, I think, I mean, a lot of it has to be kind of interpreted through the lens of the time as well, because even with women writing, you know, if they wanted to get published, there were strictures on what they could depict, you know, if they wanted to get accepted for publication, because, you know, the publishing industry was still dominated by men back then. And, you know, it was like different cultures, but at the same time, I mean, some of the like the depictions of female characters that come through are actually really interesting and kind of multi-dimensional. Like in the Three Tasks, for example, I mean, the main female character in that is sort of like, in a way, she's sort of like the classic princess type. Like, she's there like in order for the hero to try and win her heart. Yeah. But she's not quite 100% in that mold. You know, she does have agency of her own, like, which I'm not going to say any more
for
about
sure,
that in
but
particular.
She is kind of stronger.
And
wiser
and cunning
and more knowing, exactly, which is interesting, and it is a reversal of that princess trope. Totally.
And then there's another one in the collection then called The Mandrake Venus.
I am fascinated by
which I am fascinated too, because
it's so modern.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's talking about sex work in it.
Yep.
It's also, I mean, it's kind of, do you think it is straight up misogynistic? Or was the writer kind of knowingly sort of creating that?
The writer was George Eliot, who was one of the leading writers of the New Woman movement. So she would have been considered like a radical blue stocking feminist in her day. And, you know, she writes like a lot of her more mundane stories are like full of like explorations of female power and female sexuality and what have you, like, which was really shocking for the time. So I'm fascinated by this one particular story because it seems to be like a complete 180 from that.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of protagonist is a man
Yeah.
who is, to my mind, my reading of it was that he was really frightened of the power of this Mandrake Venus. She's presented as beautiful but serpentine and
kind of monstrous in
basilic gaze
and that she has like influence over like any man who comes within like 100 feet of her, kind of thing. That she has this kind of supernatural power over men's minds, and maybe the tone of the story is just related to the fact that he's the viewpoint character and he's terrified of her when he goes into her presence or something. But
I feel like that's Eliot like playing with this idea of men being afraid of women's power.
Yes,
and
quite
kind
possibly,
of obviously drawing a portrait of a man who's, I suppose, cowed by a woman.
Very possibly, yeah.
Yeah,
but of course,
it's smart as hell. Like, it just feels like it's so contemporary, you know?
Indeed. And like, to be honest, like, I can hazard a guess at what the story is about, but I couldn't tell you for sure. It's so vivid and wild and strange.
Yeah, it really reminded me of Angela Carter's Knights of the Circus.
Yes.
Yeah, big style. I was like, oh, I'm loving this. It is like
totally. And like
a carnival of kind of...
And there's a strange kind of mixture in there of like, it's almost like a biblical style world, except there's electricity.
Yeah, and quite a lot of it.
And quite a lot of it.
It's a big part of it.
Yeah, and telegrams and street lights and everything.
Yeah, but there's reference too, of course, isn't there, to the myth of the apple. I think that's...
There is
in
actually,
it at one point, so that's quite interesting too, isn't it? And I suppose, like, if you look at stories in the Bible, like, it's rich, like, you know...
Yeah, it is. Like, I mean, it's...
Some of it's quite, like, you know, like bacchanals and, you know...
Oh, indeed,
I don't know if they intended the descriptions of hell to be so kind of beguiling. I'm like, seems like they're having more fun down there.
Yeah, sounds terrible.
More of that, please. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you feel, how much importance do you place on kind of like fantasy stories explaining the rules of their world? Like, I read something that I thought might tickle you, which is that in Michael Crichton's book of Jurassic Park, he went to great pains to describe how they had come up with a way to deal with the gigantic problem of dinosaurs crapping everywhere. And he had this whole passage about how they had bred special dinosaurs to eat the excrement of other dinosaurs. And I thought, that's world building. That's very detailed, Michael Crichton.
Yeah.
And so how do you feel about, like, for example, in the Sunken Island story, there is a lot given over to how this island works and how this island operates. And I did really enjoy that. But how important do you think it is?
I think that like a certain amount of rigor is necessary in order to just kind of establish the parameters of the story. Because if it's a story where, you know, nothing is concrete and literally anything is possible, then, you know, there's no stakes. You know, there's no peril. There's no, like, you know, it's like Rupert the Bear, you know, with one bound Rupert was free kind of stuff. You know, which I suppose like that kind of fantasy has its place as well. But, you know, in order to kind of make the fantastic elements sort of pop, you know, it needs to be grounded fairly, not excessively realistically, but like just enough to contrast the mad stuff.
Oh, totally, and to give obstacles to the heroes as well, as you said.
Totally, yeah. Because I mean, if the hero walks from A to B and nothing happens in between, like, you know, why bother?
Just stay at A.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, I mean, it's one of the things that annoy. Like, I'm about to, you know, crap on Indiana Jones here, but you know, like
for it.
You know, like Raiders of the Lost Ark. When you look at what happens in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones could have just stayed at home and the end result would have been the same. You know, his actions had no impact on
Just nothing's changed.
on the outcome. You know, I mean, it's a very entertaining film, but that kind of annoys me. now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that same could be said of Harry Potter, really.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I feel like
really.
we were forced to go all the way around the world only for him to get with his teenage girlfriend and for nothing to have ever really happened. And I think that is a series that's really guilty of making up new rules as it goes along somewhat.
Yeah. Well, I haven't read the Harry Potter series myself, but I mean that is something that I hear from other people, and you know, I suppose, you know, I'm trying to be diplomatic here because I don't want to kind of lash into a series that I haven't read, but yeah, I mean, like J.K. Rowling isn't the only person who is guilty of that.
Yeah,
Anyway.
who else would you say?
Oh, Jesus.
Well, I find like in The Lord of the Rings, conversely, it's very meticulous in terms of like what is possible in this world.
Yeah, to the point almost of fossilization, you know.
Yeah, it does kind of make it a slog. Those half-page footnotes.
Jesus, yes. And when the films came out, people were saying, "Oh my God, it's amazing! Like it's exactly how I pictured it." And like, well, of course it is, because Tolkien doesn't let you picture it any other way. He tells you everything, and like it's like, imagine it like this, you know. So it's no wonder the films were exactly the same.
Yeah, and then I suppose in terms of like building a fantasy world is obviously very seductive for a reader because it's true escapism. But I did very much enjoy the story What is a Ghoul, which is actually situated in our world very cleverly by the writer.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you came across that story?
I came across this when, like, years ago when I was doing research for another academic book. I have an academic book about monsters in Irish literature. So, you know, like I used to kind of look at newspaper archives for stories of weird things happening. To kind of form general background to the literary stuff. So, you know, like there's all kinds of things about strange animals on the loose and that kind of stuff. But I came across this thing. I searched for Ghoul, and then I came across this newspaper article from 1890. No author, no attribution, no indication that this is a work of fiction. It's just presented as a news item.
Yeah.
And it's all about a ghoul that was captured in County Meath, around Larracore.
Yeah.
You know, and it had been raiding graveyards for ages, like, and digging up freshly buried corpses. And then, like, these people lay in wait in a churchyard one night and they caught it. And it's like very, very, again, like, creepy kind
so
of
creepy
atmosphere.
I have a little bit here actually that I wanted to ask you if you'd like to read.
Yeah, sure.
It's that moment where they're in the graveyard and they spot the ghoul and describe it for the first time.
All right, here we go. They waited breathlessly for hours, and about 1 o'clock a figure was observed to glide along the west wall of the enclosure and step cautiously into the moonlight. It paused a moment as if to listen, and then fell upon all fours and crept to a newly made grave, where it began tearing up the earth in dog fashion and with marvellous rapidity. The watchers remained quiet for 10 minutes before making an onset, and then rushed forward and surrounded the thief. But, to their horror, the creature leaped to his feet, uttering a hoarse, inhuman scream that almost terrified them to death. The moon shone out vividly, and by its light they beheld a being in the form of a man that to look upon was to loathe beyond endurance. A body covered with thick, crispy hair from head to foot, face and palms included, eyes small and sunken with a wild glare, mouth large and brutal with 4 tusks at least 5 inches long, curved inward, and hiding a small receding chin. The nails, 3.5 inches in length, were strong and thick and hollow as a gauge. The creature was at least 5 foot 10 inches in height, but so lean and fleshless that its weight did not exceed 120 pounds. The crown of the head pointed upwards, and the circumference around the brow was not over 12.5 inches. The most remarkable feature of the visage, save the tusks, was a pair of gigantic ears of the human shape and standing out from the head.
Ugh.
So,
It's so creepy, but also it's such direct, like,
Yeah,
style of
and
reporting.
exactly, this is reportage. Like,
Yeah.
they're saying, like, this is what the thing weighed. These are its measurements.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was like, and then, like, it goes into all this stuff that happens afterward, like the legal and medical and spiritual consequences of capturing a ghoul. And then, like, there's an offhand reference to some witness to a previous ghoul hunt. It was like, oh yes, he was present for the capture of the Knockfinnon ghoul in 1853, and he corroborated many of these details. So when I was doing my research, I was kind of like this is obviously made up, but I'm just going to check that. So I looked to see if there was like another ghoul outbreak or something, but obviously it's just a work of fiction. But we have no idea who wrote it.
And it was the Irish Examiner in 1890, wasn't
In
it?
1890, yeah.
That's so funny. And there was no reference, like, on the page to,
Nope.
like, and this week's fiction comes from...
No, nothing.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, like, that, like, playing with form is another thing that just feels really contemporary. It feels like, you know, like the found footage at the start of, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre or the Blair Witch, or like even the kind of, like, viral marketing campaigns that, like, horror franchises do so frequently now. So just very, very creepy, scary, and funny, that one. I thought
it is. It's unique.
It is,
really, think,
the description of the ghoul being held in captivity and refusing food, but, like, guzzling water. It just, there's something just a whole load of wrong about it, you know, which is very effective. So yes, in a couple of the stories in It Rose Up, and certainly in so many fairy tales, there's a kind of focus on a kind of magical agreement. Yeah. And how that might ultimately be the downfall of the main character of the story. Do you think there is a lot of lessons in these stories in It Rose Up?
I think that, I mean, I think that, you know, all, you know, like, I'm going to get very pretentious and academic now, but I mean, I think that all human literature is motivated. So even if there isn't, like, a direct moral pointed out to people at the very end, I think there's always, like, a lesson or an argument or a point in every story. So some of them in It Rose Up, I mean, it's clear that, you know, there is a moral message here. But in other ones, like, if there is one, it's going to kind of make you work a little bit harder to figure out what it is. Like the Mandrake Venus, I have no idea what the moral of that is supposed to be, but you definitely get a sense that at least 3 or 4 different arguments are being made there.
Yeah,
it's a very dense.
It feels, that one feels kind of like a comment on, you know, the kind of the male sort of treatment of women, and kind of that one feels smart and political.
And then there's Transmigration by Dora Sigerson Shorter,
which I was about to just ask you about.
Which is, like, you know, the worst human being in the world gets his wish granted, and he doesn't face any consequences for it. I mean, spoilers, but you know, like, all the consequences that should befall him fall on someone else. And there's no resolution for it. And then at the end of it, he feels awfully sorry about it. But, you know, like, that doesn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
I love the opening line of that story. It's this basically kind of description of how the narrator is, like, extravagantly doomed. I've rewritten it here because it took me so much. Many men have tasted hell some moments of their lives, a hell of their own making perhaps, but I, oh God, I have been in the hell of the damned. It goes on to say that his preoccupation with pleasure led him to play in the world, quote, until the dust of it rose up and clouded my eyes, till the hand of innocence I held in mine was changed for the hand of sin. So obviously the anthology takes its title from those lines. Can you tell me why you chose It Rose Up?
Well, like, I mean, I'll admit straight up, I am shite at picking titles for things. I'm hopeless at picking titles for things. So Sarah and Lisa and Laura Waddell from Tramp, they all kind of, like, we had a brainstorming session on like via email about what to call it. And the title for A Brilliant Void had come from a line in one of those stories. So I said, well, like, why don't we try something like that for this? And it rose up just like that tiny little snippet out of that sentence. It struck us as being, you know, it's mysterious, it's kind of odd, you know, it poses a lot of things without actually answering. It's like a mental speed bump. And we thought, oh yeah, that's interesting actually. That kind of catches the brain when you're reading it. So like that'd be a good thing to use as a title.
Yeah.
But in a broader, more philosophical sense, like when I was thinking about it later, is like he's talking about being jaded with the world. And like the dust of it rose up and clouded my eyes. Like, you know, he's somebody who turns to badness because the world has just become mundane and boring to him. And I think that, you know, fantasy kind of intersects with human life at that point, you know, because, you know, like there's all, like I said before, like, I mean, there's always those moments where we go, oh, Jesus, God almighty. And then we have our flights of fancy. You know, it's like a pressure release thing.
It also feels like it's describing how stories form in the storyteller.
Yeah,
Like that's where it kind of took me immediately was It Rose Up feels like the stories that demand to be told when you are a writer or a storyteller or a collector of stories and an organizer of stories. When you start building a collection like It Rose Up, where does it begin? Where does the work start for you?
Well, it starts just with, you know, archival research, you know, kind of diving into what people have written about things in a certain genre. So I started looking at academic things that deal, however briefly, with fantasy. Then I'll kind of go into archives of old magazines and stuff like that and check out the book reviews, like in old magazines and old newspapers and so on, just to see like if there's anything out there that hasn't already been documented very extensively. And then like the National Library is a fantastic resource as well. And they have an amazing online resource called Sources.
Okay.
Where you just go in there and you type a keyword and it'll bring you up a list of all, like basically every article that was ever published in an Irish magazine or a newspaper or journal. So, you know, you go in there and you type in, okay, dragon, and it'll bring you up, you know, like everything that has the word dragon in its title that was published in Ireland in the 19th century. So that's what I do. Then I come up with a list of possible titles, and then what I used to do then was I would come up to the National Library, like I'm based in Limerick, so I'd hop on a train, come up to Dublin, go to the National Library, and I just kind of spend a leisurely few hours in there.
That's a fantastic place to spend any amount of hours.
It's an amazing space.
It truly is. Yep. It's an amazing place to work.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if they'd thank me for announcing that as a non-academic, that I have a card and slink in there. But it's a wonderful, beautiful place to work. Oh, it's a beautiful place.
And then when lockdown came, it was like, oh my God, why didn't I do all of this 6 months ago?
Yeah. And the thoughts of it all just being in there, frozen in
time. And not being able to access it.
Yeah, so frustrating. Yeah. And so tell me, there's a number of like unforgettable phrases and words in the stories in It Rose Up. I particularly adored eggs and egg milk.
Yeah.
Which describes boiled eggs, apparently. I was like, ooh, but also wonderful. I'm only ever calling the boiled water egg milk from now on. But how do you find out the translations of these kinds of idiosyncratic sort of turns of phrase?
Like with great difficulty. In some cases. Eggs and egg milk was actually comparatively easy to find because, you know, you can find old dictionaries of slang that will tell you certain things. Or, you know, if it's like a really kind of idiosyncratic country phrase, you know, I can ask my mother or my father, you know, like, do you ever remember somebody saying this and what the hell does it actually mean? And they could normally kind of figure that out. but then like for some of the things that were translated from Irish, like particular, like there's the story MacDoho's Pig and what came after, because it's based on an old hero tale, and there's a lot of like really prehistoric place names in there that you kind of go, well, where exactly is this? Because I mean, it's not like that I was going to translate them to their English modern versions, but I wanted to have footnotes explaining where they were. And you know, it's like the ford of the small yellow dog and that kind of thing. Like, where is the ford of the small? Where is it? And you can't just Google it because Google doesn't know what you're talking about. So you know, it varies according to what exactly you're looking for.
Yeah, well, like, I mean, it was amazing kind of, I mean, how much you got, I guess. Your footnotes are like a lovely, comforting, guiding hand, and occasionally a very wry and witty addition.
Thank you very much.
It's brilliant. It makes you feel like you're partnered with Jack Fennell as you're going through these stories. Do you have a favorite story in the collection, or a couple?
It would have to be a couple, I think. I mean, obviously, I love the Ghoul. I mean, the Ghoul is just very close to my heart for all its weird little eccentricities.
Same.
Yeah. I like the 3 tasks.
Yeah.
Because like, just being very superficial about it, because of the talking dog.
Yeah.
Like if there's like an unspoken rule. If you find a story with a talking dog in it, you have to include it. You know, them's the rules. So the 3 tasks. I also I like some of the like more poignant ones, like The Sea's Dead.
Yeah, which, I really love that.
Which, you know, it really kind of, it doesn't kind of beat you over the head with any explicit meaning or anything like that, but you just get like this sense of separation and of alienation and, you know, like real deep kind of sorrow there, but it's not explicitly articulated. It's all just kind of hovering under the surface.
Exactly. Yeah. I loved that one for its kind of, I suppose, depiction of the kind of old Irish Islander attitude to the sea.
Yeah.
I think it was in Sing that I was reading about how the fishermen in the Aran Islands wouldn't learn to swim because it would be almost like kind of a middle finger to the ocean.
Yeah.
A sense of like, oh, I can master you. You know, so kind of hubris, I suppose, in the face of the ocean. So it was very fascinating on that level.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously the main character in that, there is a question mark over her origins and the Islanders. She's kind of othered by her intense love of the sea. Yeah, it's it's beautiful.
Yeah, and there's a whole question about whether or not she is fully human, which... that's actually like, it's quite a common thing along the West Coast, you know, like nearly every village has a story about some family that were supposedly descended from Selkies, that kind of thing. And like there's even like a Bantry in West Cork, like there was supposedly a woman there who had scales because her mother was a mer woman who had married a fisherman.
Or terrible psoriasis. We don't know which.
We don't know which. This ain't no judgment call.
And is Selkies the seal connection?
Yeah.
What were those creatures supposed to look like? Do you know?
They were supposed to look like ordinary seals, but then, you know, they could turn and then kind of look like equally ordinary people. But like most of the merrows or mer people back then, they were supposed to have a cap, like a red cap or some other kind of cap, and that was like their magical thing that allowed them to move between the 2 worlds. So if a fisherman wanted a merrow for a bride, all he had to do was steal her cap and hold it from her, and she would never be able to return home. So that's a pleasant thing to contemplate. Similar
to certain parts of the internet today, sadly.
Yeah.
It's very it's interesting, I guess, that like power dynamics exist in these stories and they remain unchanged.
Oh yeah, totally.
Well, it's absolutely stunning collections.
Thank you very much.
So much for chatting to me about it.
Thank you for having me.
It Rose Up was supported by the Arts Council and published by Tramp Press, and it is out now in paperback, so go get it, and in ebook from your favourite bookseller. Also, check out the rest of the Dublin Book Festival's website to find out what other events are on.